Alright, class, when we left off yesterday, we just got done with Hannibal. So, who was this Hannibal? What did we learn about him? Yes, that's right, exactly. Hannibal was the military commander or general from Carthage, which, let's remember, let's orient ourselves back to the map here, this time period. Carthage, largely forgotten about in world history today, was a major rival of Rome during the early years of the Republic. They engaged in 3 wars together. There's fighting both in Italy, back in North Africa. Carthage is ultimately burned to the ground. But the result of these wars is Rome wins. And they go on in world history. Carthage does not. But with Hannibal, he's really the first military commander to pose a real threat to the Italian homeland, to Rome, the city itself. It really all started with Hannibal. He wins the major victory at Cannae in Italy, and from there he nearly conquered all of Italy itself. He, of course, ultimately loses, but from that point on, Romans feel a major threat from who they call barbarians, and in the next centuries moving forward, there's a major fear of these barbarians coming from the north, such as the Gauls and the Germanics. And it's really these threats that are going to give rise to the Roman Empire. Remember, at this time, throughout all the wars with Carthage, throughout this entire time period, they are a Roman republic. They have no king, they have no emperor, they are a republic. This ultimately falls to the rise of the Roman Empire, which we'll get into at the end of the day. But to start today, we are going to examine the structure of the Roman Republic and then try to understand how this republic was ultimately replaced by the empire. So looking at our timeline now, the Roman Republic is 509 BC to 27 BC, and then the Roman Empire 27 BC to 476 AD. So now we're finally getting into what we call the Common Era now in world history within the last 2,000 years. So now get on Google Classroom or pull up your classwork. There's going to be a new graphic organizer put in there that is going to include all the key terms for this lesson. We'll fill them out as we go. And then also, following along in your book, you can turn to page 195 to get started. That's where it begins talking about the Republic. So I took all these key terms for your book. So to begin, Roman social classes, really broken down into 2 major social classes. They exist during the time of the Republic and the Empire. Okay? At the top is your patricians. This is the land-owning upper class. Remember when we talked about the aristocracy with Greece? The aristocracy is kind of that elite class of citizens who own land. And it's really those people that control this so-called democracy. Athens especially, who prided themselves on being democratic, they really weren't democratic in the sense that we would see democracy. Really, that democracy is an apparatus to protect the aristocracy. They control it, they stay in power, they're able to create laws, elect officials who they want. Very similar in Roman society, though it's much in the same way. Those patricians are really your aristocracy. They are not the majority of the population. The majority of the population are the plebeians. They do not own land. They are the farmers, merchants, artisans who make up most of the population. And there was really an effort in Roman society to keep these classes separate. For example, we look at page 196. It has a table of Roman laws, or the 12 tables that were developed during the time of the Republic, which really created kind of categories of laws. One of them is it outlawed marriage between patricians and plebeians. So the Roman Republic really developed from the patrician class or the aristocracy. Now, the structure of Roman government. Okay. Our Senate in the United States is really inspired by the Roman Senate. They are the first government in the world to create a governing body. They call it Senate, or similar to what we would think of as the Senate. This is the legislative body. And we talked about in an earlier class, what is the legislative branch? What do they do? Well, there's three branches of government. All governments have three branches of government. Legislative is, exactly, they are the law-making body. So when the Senate begins, there are 300 members of patrician men. So this is the aristocracy. I may have to check myself because your book does not explain how they are appointed, but I believe they were elected by patrician men, landowning males of the aristocracy. So there's a 300-member legislative body. They are the ones voting on creating laws. So that's really the central part of the government, the law-making body of the government. Now so that would be their legislative branch, very similar to our legislative branch. That's all they had to begin. Now, what they would have had for, say, an executive branch, like our executive branch, the president, he is the executive, he is the top guy in charge, makes sure everything, he makes sure everything gets done. Does he make the laws? No, the president does not make the laws, that's the legislative body's job. But he is kind of that supervisor, make sure everything goes according to plan, follows the rules. So what the Romans had as what would be an executive branch was a position of two consuls. They did not have one executive, they had two consuls. They were chosen by the Senate to really supervise government affairs, government business. They're there to supervise, make sure everything goes according to plan. So that's all the power they have, or that's how they're in charge in that sense. They're not making laws, they are supervising government affairs. Now then another part of the government comes into play later on. It talks about it on page 196 under the paragraph where it begins, plebeians demand equality. So when this Roman Republic begins, really the only people that have representation in the government are the patricians. They're represented by the Senate. And then from the Senate you get the two consuls. So now think in our American sense, we believe in a representative government. And that's what Romans wanted as well. Plebeians were saying, hey, we're not being represented. And from this is where you get the position of tribune. These are government officials elected by plebeians, right, and they kind of work for their interests. Now, prior to the plebeians, you would have what you really call a unicameral legislature. Okay? If I use the terms unicameral or bicameral legislature, does anyone know what I'm talking about? Let's put it this way. In our American government today, do we have a bicameral or unicameral legislature? We have our legislative body is Congress. What are the two parts of Congress? Now you've got the Senate, and then you've got the House of Representatives. Okay, there are like two sectors or two parts of Congress. It's bicameral. There's two houses. Our bicameral legislature is really based off British Parliament at the time of the Revolution. To this day, British Parliament still has House of Lords, which represents like the upper class, the aristocracy, or that's what it did at the time of the Revolution. And then they had the House of Commons, supposed to represent the common man. That's really what we tried to create in our government. Was the Senate was more representative of the upper class, in the House of Representatives lower class. Now, we don't really think of it that way today, because we think of ourselves as more of a equal society where we don't have class structures like that in the country. That's really why it started out that way, because it was based off that British system. Because the British had an aristocracy in their society. They were represented by the House of Lords. Lower class, the common man, were represented by the House of Commons. The British Parliament was really based off the Roman system. So we're based off the British system, British are based off the Roman system. This idea of a Senate and a tribune is really your first example of like an upper house, lower house, bicameral organization of the government. One last position that we really need to cover, just because this becomes very important with Julius Caesar, is the position of dictator. Now, dictator, in our common language today, the way we think of the word dictator, it has a negative connotation, a bad person. Dictator, the origins of the word was just a position in the Roman government. In a time of military emergency, there was a law on the books that said that the Senate could appoint a dictator who had absolute command and control. Now, let's think back to like the first unit, and we're talking about the formations of early governments and like the River Valley civilizations, who have absolute monarchs. Right? We talked about, we had a lot of discussion over why did absolute monarchs rise in these River Valley civilizations, not necessarily in civilizations like the Celts, who had a smaller like village chieftain culture. Why was it? Exactly. They needed to have absolute monarchs because their lands were under threat. They had small areas of valuable land. So it's really that idea throughout human society that in the face of a real outside threat, people are willing to give power to a dictator or someone who has absolute power. So now think back to Hannibal. There's Hannibal, and I talk about the Gauls and the Germanics. They are the people bringing this threat to Rome. And now let's watch some of the documentary on Caesar, kind of get a sense of how Caesar comes to power, and what he's using to gain power.
Consul is to hold Rome's most prestigious position, and comes not only with the lucrative governorship of an entire Roman province, but the military command of the legions stationed there. Caesar is a natural politician.
Julius Caesar was brilliant in his ability to relate to people, to make them like him. But he was also one of the greatest writers and one of the greatest public speakers. Julius Caesar could make you do what he thought you should do by giving you a speech.
Among his admirers is Marcus Brutus, the child of his favorite mistress. He quickly becomes Caesar's loyal protege. Brutus is inspired by his mentor's populist campaign and will one day move into politics himself. Caesar's campaign for the office of consul wins him many supporters, but his appeal to the commoners of Rome and his campaign for change lose him the support of the conservative aristocrats.
He sets himself up quite deliberately as a person who will try to change the system of government. And he's a real threat to conservatives because Caesar appears as somebody who stands for something new. He stands out in every way as their antithesis, and there's very little they can do about it.
Still, even if Caesar is elected consul in Rome, the conservative senators can deny him the one thing he wants and needs the most, the governorship of the profitable province of Gaul.
Caesar needed money badly. He was so far in debt that he had literally to run away from his creditors.
All of Caesar's financial difficulties will be over if the Senate will grant him his wish for the province of Gaul.
For Caesar, it was absolutely crucial to get Gaul assigned to him by the Senate as his province. If Caesar was successful in Gaul, he could make a lot of money from the enemies that he captured and sold into slavery and from the booty that he took.
It is essential that Caesar win the election and the governorship of Gaul. He develops a plan to ensure this happens. In the brutal arena of Roman politics, one should never fight alone. Caesar arranges a meeting with the two most powerful men in the Republic. One, an old friend, Crassus, the richest man in Rome. He funds all of Caesar's political campaigns. The other is the celebrated general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey the Great. Dying as a gladiator in the arena, Caesar convinces Crassus and Pompey to work with him to win the election and control the Senate.
Caesar really was the third man. He wasn't as distinguished as Pompey militarily, and he certainly wasn't as rich as Crassus. But Caesar had that glow, that aura, that charisma that nobody else had.
This extraordinary alliance becomes known as the Triumvirate.
The triumvirate is so powerful that they gain control of the political apparatus. They are able to almost, in a sense, bestow offices at will. And of course, this is going to put the bit in the bridle on the freedom of the aristocracy, which they greatly cherish.
To seal the deal, Caesar proposes a marriage contract between his daughter Julia and Pompey.
Marriages, especially among Roman aristocrats, are not so much love